This is our new chapter on European imperialism in Africa and Asia. Essentially, this is when the Europeans have almost a second age of exploration, except now instead of going out to discover places that had previously been unknown, it's going to places that have already been found and taking advantage of the resources that the Europeans know are there. Now, this happens for a variety of reasons, and you never want to oversimplify things too much, but with that said, here we go. Here are some of the main causes for why this happens. You could probably lump them together into a few general categories like political reasons, economic reasons, religious reasons, ideological reasons, and even just a general desire for continued exploration of the globe. But there's some particular characteristics that we want to look at here, some terms that you need to be familiar with as we move forward. So the first of those terms is going to be the word imperialism. Imperialism is a particular kind of control, a method of one country ruling another. This is not so much about coming in with your military, guns blazing, and invading, occupying, and possessing a country, although in some cases it might actually look a little bit like that. But it's usually a little bit more strategic. Typically, imperialism is about controlling another country's economy or their resources, or dictating the way that people in that place live based on your own social norms and values. It can even be controlling their government in a way that their government begins to do things the way that you want them to. Another one of the motivating factors for European imperialism is the idea of nationalism. We've talked about nationalism before. The belief in the greatness of your country, the belief in the greatness of your particular culture or ethnicity. This can also be the belief that people should be totally and completely loyal to the country itself, to the idea of the country, not so much a particular ruler, but that you draw your identity from the fact that you are American, German, French, Russian, and that idea is the most critical. That you're not so much loyal to a leader, you're not followers of a particular king, but that you are, at your core, your country, and that's what matters most, and that's what all people should be. That sort of motivation is part of what's going to drive Europeans in this conquest of different parts of the world. This belief that their country is so great and that the actions that they are pursuing will demonstrate that greatness, not only to their neighboring countries, not only to themselves, but to the rest of this world. Going along with that then, if your country is the best, it's sometimes easy to end up on sort of a downhill with that idea and end up in racism. The belief that you are so much better than others, particularly because of your ethnicity. That there is something about you that is so fundamentally superior to others that then justifies the treatment of others in a way that makes them vastly inferior, in some cases even less than human. And we're going to take a look at some examples of when that takes place during this time period. And you actually see a little bit of this idea of European racism displayed in advertising. Here's actually two to take a look at side by side. On the right, you see an advertisement for hand soap, Pear's soap. And as you look at the ad, you see some sort of Navy person, an admiral, something, standing at a sink washing his hands. And then as you look around the frame of that picture, you see different locations, ships at sea, cargo arriving as you head to the bottom left, and then in the bottom right, a European-looking person handing something to someone who is clearly not European. And then as you read the text of this advertisement, you get a very strong sense of what they're after here. The first step towards lightening the white man's burden, which is an expression we'll hear several times throughout this chapter, is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness, and that this soap is a potent factor in brightening the dark corners of the earth as civilization advances. This is quite some soap, apparently. That this is actually going to radically alter the way that people live in these dark corners of the earth. That simply using a European hand soap will make them more European. Something that we're going to talk about in the next slide called assimilation. And on the left side, you see a short segment out of a larger poem from Rudyard Kipling, the author who wrote The Jungle Book. Um, and he calls this is out of a segment that he titles The White Man's Burden. And he says, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness, unfluttered fold and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child." This was apparently a little bit of a critique. There's a sarcastic tone that Kipling used when he wrote this that's a little bit critical of this idea of the white man's burden. You've seen it now in both examples. And the white man's burden was this belief that many Europeans had, that it was their burden, their duty, their job, to go out into the world and make other cultures become like them. To go to places that were not white, not European, Africa, India, China, and make those places like them. And you see Kipling here talking about sending forth the best ye breed, the best of Europe. Send your sons essentially into exile, into these far-flung corners of the world rather than staying in Europe, to take care of these new-caught sullen people. Sullen meaning these folks in Africa, India, China, wherever, aren't going to be happy about this. And why would they? Who would be happy if somebody showed up and started telling you what to do? But you can see the derogatory view that Europeans had of many of these people groups around the world, half devil and half child. There's clearly no sense of equality, no expectation that these people from outside of Europe are in any way, shape, or form equal to or similar to or as good as anybody from back in Europe. A couple of the terms to make sure you're familiar with and that you may not have heard before. Social Darwinism, if you break it down, you may actually find some parts of it that you have heard before. You may have learned in your science classes about Darwin, his idea of the survival of the fittest in nature, that nature sort of self-selects because those that survive are the ones that continue to thrive and breed and perpetuate the species, and those that for whatever reason haven't worked out or haven't developed the abilities or the skills to survive die off. Some people during this time period, the late 1800s, early 1900s, begin to apply this to societies, to people, and begin to believe that societies function the same way that animals and plants in nature do, namely that the better ones survive and the inferior ones will and should die off. Again, another way of looking at this is that this provides another level of justification, that if you are stronger than another society, you're then justified in surviving and thriving because they have proven themselves to be inferior. Now, if you don't just wipe them off the map completely, which again is rarely done, we're not seeing that kind of conquest in the world so much at this point. The goal in many cases is to make those people that you are taking over or controlling become like you. Because as social Darwinism has told you, you are clearly better. And so the idea of assimilation is that over time, these people that you are coming to control or dominate will take on aspects of your culture and your society, that they will become like you. That's what assimilation is. They become like you. If you look at the picture, this lonely red apple sitting there amidst a sea of green apples, assimilation would say that over time, not that it's biologically possible, but that this red apple should over time turn green, become like the others, be absorbed into this group, and stop being different. Finally, in the midst of all these other reasons why this age of imperialism is happening, one is the idea of geopolitics. Geopolitics being the politics of place, the strategic importance of a particular place in the midst of its surroundings. So again, if you look at the picture, if you're in the midst of a vast desert, an oasis, trees, shade, grass, water takes on huge significance. And you're going to find that there are going to be several places in the world that seem small, almost insignificant, but that different European nations are hotly pursuing because of their strategic importance, because of their location, because controlling that location gives them control over a much larger area or over a larger supply of resources, something to that effect. And so don't be surprised when you see Europeans going to small locations or places that seem just kind of out of the way. There's usually some strategy involved there. And so finally, as we're rounding up this section on the causes of imperialism, we're going to take a look at how some of these factors from outside of Africa and some of the characteristics within Africa kind of converge to create this perfect storm that allows for Europeans to take full advantage of particularly Africans, but also people throughout Asia. So as we've talked about before with the European motives, nationalism, the belief in their own greatness, the greatness of their particular European country, couple that with economic competition, the desire for riches, the same thing that motivated them during the age of exploration is once again popping up, the desire for wealth, monetary wealth, resource wealth, whatever. And then add to this what we were talking about before with social Darwinism and racism. This belief that's developing in the 1800s into the 1900s that Europeans are simply a superior culture. And so not only are they allowed to, but they actually have a burden, the white man's burden, to go to some of these places and make them become like Europe, that they're actually doing them a favor. So all of this is enough to get Europeans out the door and into northern Africa and then southern Africa, the Middle East, India, China, and every place in between, even up into Japan, and begin to bring forth both their ideals and their technology. And as you skip down to the external forces, that technology is really going to be what allows Europeans to do this. The beliefs by themselves wouldn't have been enough. But there's some new inventions, thanks to the Industrial Revolution, that allow Europeans to go to these places and subdue whole cultures. The one is the birth of essentially what today would be called the machine gun. The Maxim gun was one of the first automatic weapons capable of shooting about a bullet a second. That gives you incredible military dominance, even against places that have guns, but maybe slower firing guns where you have to shoot and reload and shoot and reload. This kind of firepower allows a few people to stand against hundreds or even thousands and have a chance. The birth of the railroad and the steam-powered ship, the steamship, allows Europeans incredible transportation access to new places. The steamship lets them go anywhere in the oceans, with the wind, against the wind, with the current, against the current, and especially up rivers. Up rivers means you have access to the interior of countries that you never had access to before. And then once you're there and you can build a railroad, railroads now give you fast transportation and the ability to carry huge numbers of people and supplies to wherever you're going. Now, the final thing that Europeans had to overcome, particularly in Africa, was the disease malaria. For the longest time, Europeans that went to Africa during the slave trade were dying by the hundreds of the thousands because of this disease. There was just nothing they could do to stop it. But thanks to Edward Jenner and the idea of vaccinations, a lot of research was done into diseases, how to prevent them, how they were caused, and somebody stumbled upon the cure for malaria. And so with that in hand, Europeans were able to go to Africa and be untouched by this incredible killer. So you have their motivations, you have the new technology that gives them an advantage, and then within Africa you had some characteristics that really prevented the African people from resisting the Europeans. One, as we've talked about before, Africa is not a country. African is not a language. They're not a common people. They're not a unified people. They're not the same. There's 50 plus countries today in Africa. There are hundreds of dialects. It's a diverse area, much like any other part of the world. And that diversity, in this case, prevented the continent as a whole from uniting, which you'd never expect in Europe or Latin America or Asia or any place else, that an entire people living on a continent would come together and cooperate. That's never happened. But that's part of what makes it easier for the Europeans to come in and control first one part and then another. Add to that, comparatively, the fact that Africans have a lower level of technology. The Europeans are coming in with machine guns and the railroad and steamships, and many African cultures had received guns during the slave trade, but those guns are now way behind the times. Other cultures never received guns and are still fighting with spears or bows and arrows. And you just can't compete against machine guns at this point. And then don't forget, as we had talked about during the slave trade, that many African kingdoms had rivalries with each other. And so this idea of ethnic strife, this competition between different African kingdoms, hasn't gone away yet. And they're still in many cases more concerned about each other than they are about Europeans. And so that sort of focus on each other instead of on outsiders, those rivalries, Europeans will actually be able to take advantage of those and support and promote one side over the other, rather than allowing two African cultures to unite against the Europeans. So you add all of that up, and these are kind of all of the reasons why European imperialism is able to be successful as they begin. So next we're going to take a look at what happens when Europeans go into some different places in Africa, and then later as they head into different parts of Asia.